always see comments under some of my videos where I speak about Kenya and how we can move forward and also life abroad, about how I should stop comparing Kenya to the Western world, that we have our African culture, that I'm too westernized. I always find this to be so funny because a lot of Kenyans and even a lot of Africans are actually very delusional about this idea of African culture. The Africa of today is very much westernized, and actually for the past few weeks I've been exploring this idea of African culture. I even went digging into my father's library and found books that have written about African history from the pre-colonial Africa. These are some of the books that I have read, and from what I've gathered so far, which actually goes hand in hand with the theory or thesis statement I had about this idea of African culture, it is safe to say that this idea of African culture that a lot of people are always throwing around doesn't exist. Each and every time that we're having discussions about societal issues as Kenyans or as Africans, many times you see that a lot of people do not want to engage in these conversations. The only thing they have to say is like, oh, we need to go back to African culture. I find it incredibly fascinating how a lot of people are always thinking that the Africa of the past was this heaven, this paradise. But you know, it's not really the fault of a lot of people, because a lot of them actually don't know what Africa was like. And there's always this idea of romanticizing something that you don't know. It is a fact that a lot of Africans today wouldn't want to live in the Africa of the past. That pre-colonial Africa that you keep romanticizing and think that you want to go back to, you wouldn't even survive. First of all, I find that this idea of calling it African culture is deeply flawed, because even when you look at the Africa of today, there's a reason why we are so divided. It's because we don't look eye to eye in a lot of things, and even when we come to the tribal level, because a lot of us are organized according to tribes, a lot of tribes, even in the same region, do not see eye to eye on some things. From the books I've been reading, I've gathered that even in pre-colonial Africa, in tribes around the East African region, there were things that were very similar amongst tribes, but there were also very many differences. Taking the example of this idea of having twins, some tribes in the East African region celebrated having twins, while some others saw that as something that is evil. If you just take the bird's eye view of Africa as a whole continent, there are definitely things that you could attribute to Africans, but there are also very many things that are very different. If we had more similarities than differences, then it would mean that right now we would have achieved the unity of the continent. We wouldn't need visas to go from one country to another. It would be easy to carry out trade amongst African countries, and Western colonization actually created more divisions. This idea of African culture doesn't really make any sense, because what does it really mean? And I always find it so ironical how it is Africans themselves that will always be quick to talk about African culture, but the same Africans are really mad when people outside of Africa refer to Africa as a monolith. One of the things that I really liked when reading this book is actually in the introduction, where this author defines culture, and he says that culture is a way of life as lived by a people in a particular moment in history in response to social, political and economic challenges. This is a wholesome definition, and it's a definition that reminds us that this idea of saying let's go back to African culture doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the people who are living in that Africa that people keep romanticizing, they were responding to the social, political and economic challenges of their time, and a lot of those things might not work today. One of the things that is constantly being brought up about African culture is the idea of community. People are always talking about how we need to go back to being in community. We've lost that. People are becoming individualistic. I mean, yes, we're becoming more individualistic because the capitalistic economy is what it calls for. Capitalism thrives when people are just living on their own, because an individual will consume more. We're telling ourselves that Africans were living in community, but why? We need to be asking ourselves why they were doing so. It's not because that was a choice for them. It's because that was a survival mechanism. In the Africa of the past, a lot of people were organized according to tribes, and most often the tribes were fighting against each other. Another tribe would come attack this other tribe, and they would steal their men who would become slaves. They would steal their women who would become their wives, would steal their cows to just add to their wealth. The reason why people were living in communities was to protect each other. And recently, especially in the Western world, when you look at the conversations that a lot of these people are having, there are calls for community. And why? Because life is becoming tougher and tougher, and people are realizing that in order to actually survive in the world of today, they need to have people around them. So again, we are seeing this call for community when times are becoming tougher. And I find it so interesting that a lot of these people who are starting to talk about community, a lot of them are from the middle class. Why is it that the more human beings get more, the they just distance themselves from other human beings. What is that about? Even when you want to talk about, oh, you know, the animals, they're always living in community, but animals are always living in survival mode. We've created a world where animals are never safe, so we can't really compare ourselves with the animals because they are always trying to survive. I wonder what would happen if we had a world where everyone was at peace and no one was trying to survive. Would we see these communities that we like to glorify? I always believe that if something is so precious, then it's going to continue for generations and generations. The fact that even in a lot of African cultures, they used to live in community, but as Africa changed, that idea of community broke down. Something that a lot of people fail to recognize is that when you are living with people, you can't do things how you want because you have to follow the laws, you have to follow the norms and the mores, and after some time that becomes an excuse for oppressing other people. I truly believe that's one of the reasons why communities only thrive when people are in survival mode. Once they're out of survival mode, these communities break down because once someone is no longer in survival mode, they want to do things that make them happy, that make them fulfilled, and most of the times that is not something that is encouraged by community. So even if as the Africa of today we decide we want to borrow that idea from the Africa of the past, it's not going to be the same. It would be people banding together according to the social class that they come from, according to the interests that they have. This is one of the reasons why the rich boys always have their clubs, the invite-only clubs. The business world, they call it networking. That is a type of community. If you want a community in this day and age, the fact is you should be able to pay for it. Pay yourself into a community. And of course, there are so many other examples, including language. I always see a lot of Africans saying, oh, we are losing our African languages. Why is that? I've always gotten comments alluding to the fact that I might not be African enough because I speak English in my videos, because of my accent when I speak English. Why are you not making your videos in your African language? So they say, because they want me to prove that I'm African. I just find this to be a very stupid way of thinking because I don't know whether you're looking around, but the Africa that I was born in, the country that I was born in, English was what I was taught. Kiswahili was what I was taught in school, but something that I wasn't encouraged to speak. And well, when it comes to my own mother tongue, no one cared to teach me. And I always saw in school the people who spoke mother tongue and then they transferred their mother tongue accent to the English or Kiswahili. They were always being beaten, always being made fun of. So clearly, since I was a child, it was put into my head that speaking my mother tongue is like the worst thing I could do. Obviously, now I know better, but I find that it's enough for me to just understand the language. I really do not care for learning it because one, I come from a tribe that doesn't value me as a human being because I was born as a woman. So I really do not care for keeping a culture alive, one that doesn't even care about my own humanity. I know other people see it differently, but this is just my view. But this idea that we are losing our African languages and we need to bring them back, for what reason? How is preserving those African languages going to help us in the long run? Because all I can gather from what I've been seeing for decades is that this idea of African languages is what is actually dividing us. It's one of the things that has kept tribalism alive. And this idea that people always have that, oh, we should stop speaking these colonial languages. I don't know whether you're paying attention. If you're living in the Africa of today in 2025, we have a colonial and African heritage. I don't know why we keep pretending that we are the same as the Africa of the past. No, we do have, yes, the African roots, but we also have huge colonial influences. And language is just one part of that. Let's look at the food that we're eating. Taking the example of Kenya, the tea that we drink, that was not African. The rice that we eat, that was not African. Why do we behave like colonialism didn't leave us with a heritage that is very much part of our history? When you look at the religions that a lot of Africans are always following, these things are not African. They were brought by the missionaries that actually helped the colonial establishment to take root. And actually one of the reasons why we have a lot of problems in Africa is because a lot of people are spiritually dead. The Africans of the past were deeply spiritual. They were in tune with nature, and there's so many people today who, even when there's danger that's coming, they can't tell. They don't even know how to read the signs from nature because they're not spiritually alive. Because religion cut off that spiritual connection that a lot of Africans had to nature. A lot of Africans of today do not want to hear that. They want to blindly follow what religion is saying, and religion, I've spoken about this before, has brainwashed a lot of Africans. One of the things that you're constantly seeing, especially in social media, when a woman wears a bikini or wears something that's revealing, especially an African woman, suddenly people are like, oh my god, we need to go back to African culture. These women, they're exposing themselves. When the Africa of the past, people used to walk around naked. One of the folktales of the Kalenjin people in this book, there's a part where a group of girls are actually shocked at finding a girl who is covering her buttocks because they used to walk around naked. They would just cover their reproductive organs with leaves and that's it. Because in the past, Africans used to dress according to the weather, according to the seasons, not according to what God said, not according to what religion says. This idea of you need to cover up is something that was brought by the white man. But the fact that a lot of Africans will always say that not covering up is not African culture, it just shows you a lot of Africans know nothing about the Africa of the past. When it comes to education today, a lot of parents are just sending their children to school and parents are actually not doing anything in trying to educate their children. One of the things that I really find to be absolutely fascinating is when I see comments of parents being like, do you know how hard it is to bring up teenagers, especially a girl? They think they know everything. They will just go out there and bring a child. Can you imagine having to take care of the child of your teenage girl and that teenage girl doesn't want to be told? I'm like, wait a minute, you are blaming your teenage girl for getting a teenage pregnancy, but you're the same parent that says that sex education is taboo. That just goes to show that the parents in the Africa of today have really failed at parenting because they don't even know what parenting is about. They don't prepare children for the world. They expect you to know everything. They expect you not to make mistakes. That is a complete failure. And the last example that I would say is when it comes to marriage. When it came to marriage in the Africa of the past, the only men who are allowed to marry were the ones who could pay the bride price. And to pay the bride price, it means that you need to have been born into a family where your father had cows. Because at that time, having cows, having sheep and goats and whatever, that was the measure of wealth. So the only ones who could pay the bride price are the only ones who could actually marry. But we are seeing in today's day and age a lot of men who have nothing, they're always marrying, and we are seeing more conversations on social media that it's this kind of men that have nothing that are always calling women gold diggers. But it has always been that only the men that have money that can marry. Even the ones who are always talking about there was polygamy in the Africa of the past, but the men who are allowed to have multiple wives are the ones who are rich. So even if you as a man who is broke today, doesn't have a job, doesn't have a way of sustaining themselves, not even just themselves, but sustaining a whole family, even if you went to the Africa of the past, you wouldn't be eligible to marry. So I really don't understand when people are always talking about we need to go to the Africa of the past because the women of today are gold diggers. It's definitely a lot that I can say when it comes to this topic, because clearly this idea of African culture, it's deeply flawed. We, the Africans of today, we do have a double heritage, the African heritage and we have the colonial heritage. And moving forward, we need to look at ourselves first and accept the identities that we have. I actually believe that as Africa, we have the huge advantage because of those double cultures that we have. As an African, you can easily understand the world because you have this African point of view and you have this Western point of view that was brought onto you because of the colonial heritage that we have. So at any one time as an African, you have at least two world views and you're looking at the world using those lenses. That is a huge advantage. And in the business world today, that is something that is regarded as cross-cultural communication. That is one of the reasons why when you take a lot of Africans abroad, we easily integrate because we can easily live with people who have lived different lives or who come from different cultures because that is the experience that we have in our own countries. And going back to the introduction of this book, I find that the writer also summed it up so perfectly about the African person of today. Obviously, he used he because of course he was writing from a patriarchal mind where it's only the man who is to be spoken about. There's something also seen in the Bible. Speaking of the African person of today, he's confused or looks confused because he's an aggregate. He's weak because he's confused. He's strong or can be strong precisely because he's an aggregate, a sum total. As at now, a lot of Africans are so confused about what it means to be an African because a lot of Africans are trying to compare themselves with the Africa of the past. But it's also a fact that the Africa of the past would reject the African person of today. And so instead of us just trying to define ourselves based on an Africa that doesn't exist because we are romanticizing it so much, we need to look at where we are, take whatever we have and use that as a strength. And that's how we can actually be strong. We have the minds to be leading the world in solving the problems that we are facing because we can see things from different points of view. But it seems that these multiplicities that we have are actually confusing us more because we actually do not know how to define ourselves because we are trying to just live in the past. But we need to start living in the present. We need to start acknowledging where we are instead of trying going to a past that wouldn't even welcome us.